Hi guys, welcome to week 3, and let's get into what we have. First of all, well actually before we get into what we have today, a potential warning and an apology. My daughter is here, so I am babysitting and trying to sneak this in while I'm babysitting. So if I get interrupted, I apologize. If I sense it's going to be a short interruption, I'll just get up from the screen and have a little bit of dead time. If it's going to be a little bit longer, I'll have to stop the video and make this more than one piece. Hope it doesn't come to that. But the other thing to say is I apologize for this thing being a little later than I wanted it to be. My daughter has had the flu this week. And if you're a parent, you get that. And even if you're not, you probably get it too. So thank you for your patience. We're getting through as best we can. So last week, we talked about the life of Jesus. We talked about the kingdom of God. This week is death and resurrection. Christian interview subjects. I do want you to think about those this week, and I want you, some of you already have, but I want you to input who you're thinking about talking to on the assignments tab. It's ungraded assignment, but what it does is it lets me know who you're thinking about, and it also forces you to actually think about someone, because I don't want some guy, I want a name. I want someone, some man or some woman that you are looking to talk to. So this is my way to try to motivate you and encourage you to get this stuff done early, so you're not last minute emergency, which is fine. You know, last minute emergency, sometimes when you're writing papers just for yourself, I get it, sometimes it has to be that way, but when you have someone else involved, it's a really good idea to not make it a last minute emergency, because then you start to inconvenience them. So I really want you to think about this ahead of time. So your subject is due the 26th. Now, I understand things happen, cancellations, changes. So if you have to change it after the deadline, just run it by me, and I'm sure I'll be like, yeah, I'm fine with it. But I do want you to at least give me a name of someone that you're asking sooner rather than later, right? The 26th, actually. And the other, just a general note, we're on week 3. We're starting to get into some grades and put it in the system. If you're stuck, if you're having a block, if you're having things that you're not understanding, do me a favor and take the initiative, because if I don't hear from you, I assume that means that everything is fine, all is well. All right, so let's talk about death and resurrection. We're still working through Borg and Wright. Wright argues that the empty tomb generates the claims that Jesus is alive and Jesus is Lord, while Borg argues that the claims that Jesus is alive and Jesus is Lord generate the idea of an empty tomb. Kind of a tongue twister of a sentence, but you get the idea. Wright is the traditionalist. He's the historical. He's the one who puts historical validity into this. So he's going to say, well, why did the early church say that Jesus is alive and Jesus is Lord? Well, because they found an empty tomb. Borg's got a different perspective. He is much more willing to chalk up this idea to the early church and the theological formations of the early church, whether the tomb was indeed empty or not. We'll get into that in a minute. But he argues that the claims that the church starts with this idea that Jesus is alive, Jesus is Lord, and then works backwards to create the story of the empty tomb. So it's a non-historical approach. Well, non-historical might not be the best way to put it. We'll get into how Borg describes it in just a second. But it's definitely an approach that's far different from Wright's, far different from any sort of traditional Christian take on the matter, but a take that is very, very popular in scholarship. This is the majority position, to attribute a lot of the direct claims of Jesus' divinity to formulations from the early church, and then work backwards to make a narrative that fits the Old Testament prophecies and that works. This is in New Testament scholarship. I can't stress this enough. This is the majority take. Someone like Wright, even though you think, if you grew up in a church environment, a conservative church environment, that might seem completely backwards to you. Rights might seem a little bit more natural, a little bit more just quote unquote obvious. Understand that in the scholarly community, Wright is a minority. That is not the majority take. So let me compare the takes briefly. Traditional understanding is that Jesus' death was salvific, which is another way to say that the primary purpose of Jesus' life was to die. Borg and progressives take umbrage at this. They say, if the whole point of a 33 years of life was the last week of his life and his death, then you run the risk of discounting everything that he did up until that time. And then you also get into other problems too. Traditionalists will typically answer, well, that's not what we mean. We don't mean that the death, everything else doesn't matter. The primary purpose, the most important action of Jesus' life was, ironically enough, dying. Consider these lyrics. Michael W. Smith is an older song, but it's a traditional conservative Christian song. It's called Above All. The lyrics go, crucified, laid behind the stone, you lived to die, rejected and alone. Like a rose trampled on the ground, you took the fall and thought of me above all. And you're welcome for me not singing that. But that is a very traditionalist perspective. That is the sense that, the task, the mission, the focal point of the mission was, death and resurrection. And later, death and later resurrection. You see this in the emphasis of the Gospels themselves. I mean, you take a look at the Gospel of Mark. Roughly the first half of the Gospel of Mark is Jesus' life and ministry from the age of 30. The second half is the last week of his life. There's nothing before he turned 30. And the whole second half of the Gospel of Mark is the Passion narrative, the last week of his life. So the focus is overwhelmingly on this section of Jesus' life and this action of Jesus. That he came to die. He came as a salvific, if you want to talk about atonement, if you want to talk about how Jesus' death makes possible the life of his followers, his primary mission was the sense of coming to die. Forgive me for that. Borg obviously sees things very differently. He argues strongly that Jesus does not see his mission this way. Jesus' death was a surprise to him, the way Borg puts it, and that the earliest Christian communities interpreted his death. So this is something, again, Jesus' conviction and death shocks everyone, shocks Jesus, shocks the earliest Christian community. After he dies, other communities looking around like, what do we do now? And Borg's position is that the gospel narrative, the passion narratives, come out of this. We need to conceptualize what we've just witnessed and what we've just been a part of. And it is plausible in the sense that the Gospels themselves indicate that disciples were unprepared for the idea of Jesus dying. If their hopes were shattered by his death, this is one way to find hope in despair. So Borg's position is that the disciples are completely wrecked, completely shattered. This teacher they had followed for so long is no longer there. And how do we even begin to deal with that? Borg says this is how they began to deal with that. So it's definitely two very, very different positions. Oh goodness, and I hope you'll forgive me. I just need to run upstairs very quickly. Again, I'm a little bit discombobulated, so I'm sorry about that. But just give me 30 seconds, if that, and I'll be right back. Thank you for your patience. I looked at my notes and I said, you know what? I have page numbers, but I don't actually have the book. And so there you go. Gosh, I'm really embarrassed to do that. I'm sorry. So anyway, the reason that Borg thinks this way, he wants to talk about the nature of prophecy. Prophecy in the traditional understanding is prediction, where the prophet sees something that happens sometimes even hundreds of years before it happens. Borg wants to see prophecy in terms of history. This is, instead of saying that the prophets saw something about Jesus' life and foretold it and wrote it down, the New Testament writers tailor their story, tailor their version of Jesus' life and witness and ministry and everything else to match Hebrew prophecy. So now, the way he's going to say it is it's prophecy historicized rather than predictions fulfilled. So the traditional position is that Jesus' life fulfills dozens of Old Testament prophecies, Old Testament predictions. Borg wants to say, no, the Old Testament prophecies were there. The New Testament writers knew they were there. They were there and built their story around those prophecies. So that's, it's fabrication. So he thinks that way for the nature of prophecy. He also thinks that way for aesthetic reasons. And this is one that I always found really striking. I made it your discussion question this week. He has a line on page 82. It says, honesty compels candor. I find this not only a strange notion, but an unattractive notion to attribute to Jesus. I don't want Jesus to have seen his own death as having the significance Tom gives to it. As a Christian, I want Jesus to be an attractive figure. Obviously, wanting Jesus to be attractive cannot be a criterion for making historical judgments, and I must factor this desire into my historical judgment, not only about this matter, but every other historical decision I make about Jesus. So that's a really striking admission. Honesty compels candor. I don't like the picture of Jesus that the traditionalists paint. I don't like the idea that he would see his death as his primary purpose. I don't like the idea that he would be essentially sent to die. It's unattractive. It's not a good aesthetic. And for that reason, Borg has a distaste for it. And I give him full points to admit it. But what he's saying is, I don't like that idea of Jesus, therefore I'm going to look for a different one. It's an amazing admission. So you can think about why Borg might see this perspective on Jesus unattractive. The idea of his central vocation being his death. But that's another reason. And then Borg also cites something we already mentioned, the fact that focusing on his death seems to downgrade Jesus' life and accomplishments. Like, what were the first 33 and 51 weeks of his life for, or 32 years and 51 weeks of his life for, if the only thing that mattered was the last week? This is not unique to Borg, by the way. This is a long-standing tension between what some scholars have called the cross and the crown. The crown is the initial point of his ministry when he displays his kingship, if you will, and then the cross obviously is when he lays it down and dies like a slave. That's a tension that a lot of people have struggled with, and Borg is one of them. And then finally, he cites textual questions. He asks things that again have been asked by a lot of people. How do the gospel writers know that Jesus sweated blood in the Garden of Gethsemane? Who told them that? And then on page 84, he's going to say, all right, when it comes to the gospel narratives, there are four primary elements. There's history remembered, the stuff that actually happened. There's prophecy historicized, we've already talked about. Imaginative elaboration, and purposive interpretation. So basically, the gospel writers are weaving a story, some truth, some not so much, and they are putting it together to concoct this story, to build the story of Jesus and what Jesus' death and death represented in terms of his resurrection. So Borg, obviously for that reason, Borg is going to throw out a lot of what a traditionalist would accept as legitimate. He accepts controversy in the last week of Jesus' life. He accepts some sort of ritualized meal, a Last Supper, maybe not so ritualized. He accepts the betrayal and the arrest, and he accepts crucifixion. Ancient Rome crucified criminals and revolutionaries to make an example of them, and Borg is perfectly happy to go along with this. He says that Jesus was crucified as a political threat to the Roman order. So he is perfectly happy to put Jesus on the level of a prophet who, because he was deemed a threat to the Roman order, had to be dealt with. So when it comes to Jesus' death, though, the one question that does leave, that Borg deals with, is who is to blame for Jesus' death, which is a really loaded question, obviously, a controversial question. Traditional answers have included Pilate, the Jews. Borg argues that for the early Christians to shift blame to the Jews provides political cover, we follow a teacher who the Romans killed, so, but only at the insistence of the Jews. You really, so basically what Borg is saying is that the Christians go to the Romans and say, you have no real beef with us. Yeah, you killed our teacher, but it was at the insistence of the Jews. There's the beef. Obviously, there's very real consequences to the story, and there is, whether Borg and Wright, no matter what they say, just a fact, that putting the blame on the Jews, like the Gospel of John really vociferously blames the Jews, Gospel of Mark does too, results in many, many, many years of anti-Semitism. Christ killer was an epithet that was constantly hurled at Jews by Christians, and there was also violence and just a lot of really ugly stuff that came from this. Now, obviously, we'll get into Wright's response, conservative traditionalists have a different take on the matter, but they still, if they're intellectually honest, admit that, yeah, there's been a lot of anti-Semitism that comes from this whole idea of blaming the Jews for Jesus' death, which, if you're theologically conservative, is kind of stupid, because you're implying that the Jews took Jesus' plans out of his own hands, as if this was not something that was ordained by a higher power, if you will. But yeah, so the big question for Borg, though, was Jesus killed for a political reason or for a theological one? And Borg chooses the former. He says, you know what? It's got nothing to do with who he was, got nothing to do with, theological truths or untruths. The Romans deemed him a threat, and they killed him. It's basically that simple. Obviously, Wright's response is different. He says Jesus knew what was going on. Jesus knew that a catalytic event was needed, knew that it was up to him to fight the true battle, not just against the Romans, but against the corruption of the world itself. In a traditionalist position, Rome is almost an afterthought, because Rome is the bad guy in the story, but they're only a supporting bad guy. The true bad guy is spiritual realities. And the powers that Jesus ultimately defeats, according to the traditionalist perspective, are spiritual powers. They are supernatural, paranormal, however you want to phrase it. It's not simply a political matter. It's a spiritual matter. And this was in keeping with first century Jewish thought. I mean, you have the servant songs, where the servant, in the servant songs of Isaiah, in the second half of Isaiah, over and over and over again, there is this person, sometimes called this new David, who's going to stand up against not just political authority, but spiritual authority. All of the sinister elements, if you will, of spiritual authority, and overcome them. And the way in which the overcoming was going to happen was through redemptive suffering. Isaiah 53 is the biggest example of this idea of redemptive suffering being the thing that does it. So he says, no, Jesus understands that this has to happen, and logically moves in a way to bring that about. And no, it's not a complicated form of suicide, according to Wright, because it's accepting the logical outworking of your actions. And he cites Socrates as an example, a common example. Page 99, he answers Borg, the part of Borg where we quoted, where Borg doesn't like the aesthetic of Jesus who comes to die. And the way in which Wright answers him is he warns him. He says, if we throw out things we find distasteful, we construct a Jesus that fits our own image. There's a famous line, God created humans in his image, and humans return the favor. And he comes close to accusing Borg of doing just that. Which again is a critique that many mainline progressive scholars have faced. I mean, even someone like Albert Schweitzer in the beginning of the 20th century told stories about how different people who were searching for the historical Jesus, they would look into it was as if they were looking into the bottom of the well when they were looking for Jesus. And and the socialist finds socialist Jesus. The revolutionary finds revolutionary Jesus. The American capitalist Jesus finds the American capitalist finds American capitalist Jesus. Basically, you be careful that you don't look for Jesus and just assume that the Jesus you're looking for looks a lot like you. So that's basically what he's almost warning Borg of doing here. It's like, you don't like this aesthetic, therefore you're assuming Jesus doesn't like this aesthetic either. Be careful making that claim. So as to the question of whether Jesus' death is more political or theological. Borg obviously says it's political. Wright, as you can imagine, spends more time on the theology. If Jesus is the Messiah, it's clear and present danger to the Jewish authorities, to the Jewish power structure that was built up around theology. It's really hard to separate theology and politics. We talked about the kingdom of God last week. How do you do it? Because even if we say it's theological, well, there's a lot of political capital riding on that theological idea. Jesus is dismantling, or at least he's posing as a threat to the present Jewish authorities and threatening to dismantle the temple, which was every bit as much political as it was theological. There's a lot going on there. But anyway, Wright is not willing to accept the claim that the theology of the situation is just later Christians adding it back in. That this is happening in real time, and the theological consequences are happening in real time as well. Whereas Borg says it was a political death, and then the theology was added in later by the early church. Yeah, according to Wright, Jesus' death represents the hinge point of history. The world is no longer ruled by violence and hatred. There's a new kingdom which has been planted underneath, and it will uproot the old kingdom. And it's nothing less than victory over evil. So, it is political, but it's also very much deeper than that. That is Wright's response, and again, the traditionalist response. But it's worth mentioning, and he takes time to deal with this. If this is a victory over evil, then why is evil still present? Why does evil still hang around? And I like the way he deals with it. I'm going to just go ahead and quote it. It's on page 105. He says, the larger story concerns the victory over evil as a whole that was won, according to the New Testament, on the cross. Let's scrolling down. It quickly becomes clear, of course, why this theme is regularly ignored. There's an obvious credibility gap between such a claim and the realities of the world. The now traditional scheme avoids this problem by projecting the victory on one hand inward into the heart and conscience of the believer, and on the other hand forward into the state of affairs after death or at the end of the world. In neither case is there any outward change in the world, except in that the forgiven sinner will now live in a different manner, out of gratitude for forgiveness and in the power of the Spirit working in his or her life. So basically what he's saying here is that traditionalists who want to say that Jesus conquered sin and death need to have a way to explain the fact that sin and death and evil still hang around. And the way that which they've traditionally done it, they've either said it's a spiritual victory that just affects the internal states of believers, or it's something that has been just completely pushed into the future. Wright wants to make the point that the kingdom of God, which conquers evil and sin and death, has been inaugurated in Jesus' death and resurrection, but has not been fully consummated. Another way to say this is the already with the not yet. The victory has already started, but it has not been fully consummated. It will in the future. So anyway, that brings us to Easter. And what happened on Easter? And what happened? Well, resurrection. What does that mean? Well, there's a wide range of opinions in the first century Jewish world as to what resurrection was going to mean. But literal physical resurrection was certainly a belief held by many. It was also believed that the Jews, in their perspective on resurrection, they believed it would be communal, that the wise and the righteous would be raised together. This was the traditional Jewish understanding. The Apostle Paul, working off of that and also working off of Jesus' death and resurrection. In 1 Corinthians 15, he talks about that in depth. He says resurrection as historical event. This is the beginning of the end. This is the beginning of a new period of history. Paul wants to argue that there's continuity with the physical body and also discontinuity. There is transformation, but there's also continuity. And where he says the follower of Jesus gets a spiritual body, not a ghost, but a fully ensouled body. So you have then, in 1 Corinthians 15, this expression of, all right, this is what resurrection means. Jesus obviously was the one who goes first, but through his resurrection, he offers the hope of resurrection to his followers. This is something that they can lay claim to and put their hope in, according to St. Paul, according to the traditionalist position on this. Jesus' resurrection was not just something that was meant for himself, but also to act as a gateway for his followers to be able to experience it as well. So Wright is fully traditional, or in the sense of, he really did raise from the dead. And those who would question that, those who would say, no, there are other things at work, he argues that Borg and others like him are forcing Christianity into, quote unquote, an apartment in the Enlightenment's housing scheme. In other words, Wright, as a traditionalist, is starting with the resurrection and saying not every element of it can be explained, but I'm starting there as the foundation. Whereas the Borgs of the world and the modernists of the world are going, nah, okay, we need to start with what is historically possible. We need to start with what is something that could conceivably happen, and then build theology around that. So Borg, point blank, says, could the question he asked, which I think is really interesting, could the resurrection be videotaped if such technology existed at the time? And Borg says no. The resurrection narratives are a product of what he calls a developing tradition and as powerfully true metaphorical narratives. But for Borg, the truth of Easter is not at stake in this issue. And if you might be wondering here, like, how is that possible? How, if he says that it was made up, that it couldn't be videotaped, that it was purely, a story that was representing spiritual realities, but not a story that was conveying any type of accurate view of history, then where is the meaning? What does it mean? Borg wants to say that the resurrection narratives of Jesus represent a spiritual resurrection, not a physical one. They represent Easter as a spiritual reality. Jesus is alive and how his followers experience him. So it really doesn't, for Borg, it really does not matter if the tomb was empty or not. His followers experience him as risen. They experience him as resurrected. And as a result, that is something that is good enough. That's something that they're really, they feel on a spiritual level, even if it didn't happen on an eyewitness historical level. And he is precisely Lord, because this experience of Jesus, any Christian anywhere on earth at any time can experience this. So it makes him omnipresent. The idea that he can be experienced as someone who is resurrected, not physically, not because it happened physically, but on a spiritual level. So again, I return to how I started this. According to Wright, the empty tomb happens first, and then the claims come that Jesus is alive and Jesus is Lord. They come after. Borg says that the claims that Jesus is alive and Jesus is Lord happen first, and the idea of the empty physical tomb comes after. So they kind of reverse each other. So in other words, Borg is kind of spiritualizing the death and resurrection, whereas Wright insists that, there's a lot of spiritual stuff going on, but there's also the physical, and we need the physical in order for it to make sense. That is the source of disagreement. The Borg, the more liberal, progressive, mainline thinker, if you will, is going to say you don't need the physical, you can have a spiritual reality and that's enough, whereas Wright and more traditionalist perspectives will say, no, you need spiritual as well. Or you need physical as well, excuse me. So that covers it for this week. Next week we examine the divinity claims of Jesus Christ. Who is this guy? Until then, keep going. And if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will talk to you soon.